Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to the Explainer. You wouldn't think one single cargo ship could trigger a massive diplomatic storm, right? But here we are. We've got the European Union, Israel, and Ukraine basically locked in a major standoff, and Russia's sitting squarely at the center of the whole thing. It's not just a squabble over a boat. We're looking at a huge test case for international trade, wartime alliances, and honestly the entire structure of global sanctions. So how exactly does one cargo ship cause a literal geopolitical meltdown? Well, it all started when a Russian vessel, packed with a massive shipment of grain, arrived near an Israeli port. Now, in any normal day, this is just routine commerce, business as usual. But obviously we're in the middle of a war, so this immediately set off international alarm bells. We really need to zoom in on this specific vessel because it completely exposes a critical vulnerability in how the world handles resources that cross volatile borders. The second that ship showed up, the reaction from Kyiv was, well, immediate and extremely forceful. Ukrainian officials quickly sounded the alarm. They are directly accusing Russia of stealing this exact grain from Ukrainian territories that are currently occupied because of the war. They actually have a specific term for this: economic looting. It's essentially the extraction and international sale of resources, grain in this case, from seized territories. Kyiv makes the argument that if we let these shipments into global markets, we're basically legitimizing wartime theft and, directly funding Russia's war economy. Now, what's really interesting about this is the friction it creates between the realities of war and strict legal thresholds. It's like two completely different languages being spoken. On one side, you've got Ukraine's absolute hardline stance. This grain is stolen from occupied lands, end of story. But then Israel pushes back, and they're relying strictly on maritime law. Tel Aviv argues that, technically, the vessel hadn't officially cleared port protocols yet. And, more importantly, they say Ukraine just hasn't provided the concrete legal evidence needed to prove that this specific shipment is stolen. So we're left with this fascinating standoff between direct geopolitical accusations on one hand and a very strict legal defense on the other. But here is the absolutely crucial context you need to know. We are not just talking about one isolated ship wandering around the Mediterranean. Think about this number, 30. According to Ukrainian authorities, around 30 similar shipments from occupied territories have already reached Israel since 2023. 30! Now, Israeli officials do actively dispute this number, but the sheer scale of the allegation completely elevates the situation. It takes it from a localized dispute right up to a systemic global issue that monitors are now desperately trying to untangle. To really understand why Kyiv is pushing back so aggressively, you have to look at the underlying economics. Agriculture is literally the lifeblood of Ukraine's national revenue. They are historically known as a global breadbasket. So when grain gets stolen, it's not just some standard economic grievance. It's a targeted strategic attack. Every single ton that gets extracted and sold strips away Ukraine's ability to fund its own defense and just, sustain its economy. For Kyiv, stopping this isn't about principle. It is about sheer survival. With the stakes being this incredibly high, the dispute naturally expanded, and fast. The European Union stepped into the fray almost immediately, and they brought a heavy hammer with them: the threat of European sanctions. Brussels made it unequivocally clear that, in their view, treating this allegedly stolen grain is a direct violation of international sanctions against Russia. The fact that the EU got involved so quickly really shows that they don't just see this as a bilateral argument between two nations, they see it as a direct challenge to the integrity of their entire sanctions framework. So how does the EU actually plan to enforce this? Well, they are casting a massive net. Brussels is fully prepared to sanction foreign companies, traders, port authorities, basically anyone facilitating these shipments. The message they're sending is super direct. If you help Russia profit from occupied territories, even indirectly, you're going to face severe economic consequences. And this really reflects a much broader strategy that Western countries have been using since 2022. They want to cast the widest net possible to punish any global network that tries to help bypass economic restrictions. But here is where the geopolitics become incredibly delicate. You see, it was relatively easy for the EU to impose sweeping economic restrictions on Russia, targeting their banks, tech exports, billions in trade, the whole shebang. But Israel? Israel is a long-standing EU partner. We're talking deep ties in both trade and security. Sanctioning individuals or businesses linked to an ally rather than an adversary is an absolute diplomatic minefield. It puts global diplomats in a deeply uncomfortable position, and everyone is carefully watching to see exactly how far Europe is actually willing to go here. And this brings us to Israel's nearly impossible balancing act. It's like they're walking a geopolitical tightrope.
On the diplomatic front, Israel naturally leans toward the West. They support Ukraine and want to maintain those vital Western partnerships. But if you look at it from a security standpoint, Israel faces a starkly different reality. They share a very complex neighborhood with Russia, and Moscow heavily influences Syria and other regional hotspots that are quite literally right on Israel's doorstep. If Israel takes a hardline stance against Moscow, it could shatter their own strategic security in the Middle East. It's an incredibly tough spot to be in.
Let's zoom out for a second and see how this builds, because this single standoff is really just a symptom of the broader Black Sea crisis. Back when the invasion began in 2022, accusations of agricultural theft just skyrocketed. The international community had to scramble to put together the Black Sea Green Corridor just to allow for safe exports. But fast forward to today, and that sea remains a highly volatile, heavily contested zone. Arrangements are repeatedly disrupted by conflict, making the safe, verifiable passage of legitimate goods incredibly difficult to maintain. And all of that volatility leads directly to a massive logistical nightmare for global supply chains. You know, stolen grain doesn't exactly travel with a neat little label on it saying stolen. It's very often just mixed right in with perfectly legal shipments. Once tons of this grain are poured into those massive cargo holds or mixed together in towering silos, it becomes extremely difficult to trace its exact point of origin. Think about it. How do you definitively prove to a port authority that a specific batch of wheat came from an occupied territory versus a legitimate farm? It's practically impossible. And this physical mixing is exactly why the strict legal evidence threshold that Israel is demanding is so incredibly hard for Ukraine to actually meet. So where do we go from here? Looking ahead, we're basically tracking 3 distinct ways this crisis could play out. Scenario 1, the EU makes good on its threat, imposing targeted economic sanctions and sending a massive shockwave right through global markets. Scenario 2, Israel decides to launch formal investigations and proactively blocks future shipments to dodge any diplomatic fallout. Or Scenario 3, and this is probably the most dangerous one, this localized dispute erupts into a much broader geopolitical confrontation, straining EU-Israel relations and testing global alliances right when they are already under immense pressure. We're going to wrap up our explainer today with a simple yet incredibly dangerous question. If stolen resources can be sold internationally without any consequences, what does that actually mean for the global order? That is the ultimate issue anchored to this single grain ship. And based on the EU's stern warning, it really suggests we aren't going to be pondering this in theory for much longer. Real-world sanctions might soon test this very question, and the outcome has the power to permanently reshape international trade. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep a close eye on the Mediterranean, because the ripple effects here, they are just beginning.